Today we have a great guest that's here, Arthur Ettinger, the founding partner of the firm and runs the matrimonial and family law group of Zalzano, Ettinger, Lampert, and Wilson LLP. Really excited for this one. Thank you for being here. Welcome everybody to episode 26 of Blueprint for Closers. I'm Rob Nixon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Dominic Ciccarelli. And today we have a great guest that's here, Arthur Ettinger. He is the founding partner of the firm and runs the matrimonial and family law group of Zalzano, Ettinger, Lampert, and Wilson LLP. Really excited for this one. Thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot, boys. Great to be here.
Good seeing you, Rob. We're in the dog days of summer here. A lot of vacations, and trying to coordinate this to make it happen was interesting. So thanks, Arthur, for getting on. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I think this one is especially interesting because we've kind of hit a lot of different angles of real estate throughout the last 25 episodes. And one thing we haven't covered is the unfortunate event of divorce and how that can play a major impact in any of your real estate holdings and of course in your life in general. So I guess if we could jump right in, if you could kind of tell us a little bit about your firm, what you specifically focus on.
Sure. So I've been practicing law, primarily matrimonial and family law, for about 27 years. The firm now, Zalzano, Ettinger, Lampert, and Wilson, we've been together. We've known each other, all of our partners, we've known each other for over a decade and always talked about doing something back some firms ago. And in October of 2022, we formed the firm now that's known as Zalzano, Ettinger, Lampert, and Wilson. And we pride ourselves as a full-service boutique law firm handling nearly all practices of law, commercial litigation, family law, obviously, intellectual property. We focus, there's a high concentration on sports and entertainment. We represent a lot of athletes and entertainers, and there's a literally one-stop shopping for our client base, whether it's a prenup, a divorce, incorporating, trademarking, and that's pretty much it. My group has been together for quite some time, and I've known Frank Zalzano and Jason Lampert for quite some time. We've talked for a good portion of a decade of joining back up together, and so here we are.
I'm very curious to hear, during COVID, did we see a spike in divorces?
It's funny. People would ask this all the time, like in 2020, and you'd see a lot of family law attorneys trying to self-market, and they'd say, oh, divorce is up, divorce is crazy. The reality is it was just not true because you couldn't do anything. Courts were literally closed. So people that said, oh, divorce was crazy, it was certainly, there was a massive spike once the world started to come back. But courts, literally, you wanted to file papers, they were not accepting your paperwork. So family law attorneys across the country we were kind of stifled, and the phone calls would come in. It's just, there was nowhere they were going to go.
A lot of mediation, I would presume.
I used to have consults. We were having consults. Clients would call us. We would do Zooms. I joke, before March of 2020, I'd say, should I put a suit on for this meeting? Am I going to wear a tie? Now it's, am I going to see this person? Am I going to talk to them on the phone? Or are we going to do a Zoom? Or am I going to meet you in a parking lot? People would have a consult and they would be in their apartment, and let's say their spouse was in the other room, or they'd go downstairs to the lobby, or they'd be in a car, or if it was a case out in the suburbs, they'd be sitting in their driveway. It was bizarre, to say the least. And then there was a lot of domestic violence going on. People in such cramped quarters. And if you remember, at the time, not only were we dealing with the pandemic, but there was that whole George Floyd world we were living in. And there was, the Black Lives Matter with the defunding of the police. And so you had a police force that basically wasn't allowed to do anything. I remember I did not have a vacation. And it had been we had planned to go to Block Island for 2 days. That was the extent of my vacation. And I was on the ferry going up to Block Island, and I get a phone call. A woman, her husband of 28 years, had literally locked her up in a closet for 13 hours with no food, no water, and he had beaten her profusely. And she called me, and she didn't know what to do because the cops arrived. They said, "Ma'am," he had left for a little bit. She finally got out. And the cops literally said, "Ma'am, if we arrest him, he's going to be out in 25 minutes. So just pack a bag and just go to a loved one." And it was the wild, wild west.
Wow.
But to answer your question, there was not a spike in the beginning. But as the world, where were people going to go? They were stuck. The person that they couldn't stand looking at was in the next room. There wasn't anywhere to go. Now, some people would go, let's say they'd go to Aspen if they had a house there, and they would camp out, or they would camp out at a Hampton's house or upstate. But they weren't able to commence a divorce action.
So I actually have two high-level questions, if you know them. One, what is the percentage of divorce now in marriages? Because I know at one point it was above 50%. And someone had told me recently it's actually down. Is that true?
The last time I checked, it was I think it was around 55, pushing 60%. It's above 50%.
The average divorce, call it 5 years ago, how long did that take versus now? Because it seems like there's a trend of mediation a little bit more now. I don't know, maybe because of the cost of it.
As most lawyers, I don't have like a direct answer. You can have a costly mediation. If somebody's not being forthcoming with their assets and transparent with maybe some recreational activities and there's stuff going on, a mediation could drag on for 3 years, just like litigation can. At least with litigation, you have a judge who's moving the process forward. I'd like to say that my case, the average divorce case, lasts around a year and a half to 2 years. That's not to say that I have people come in, they've spoken about the big, like you said, the high level issues. They have an understanding, and they need just some guidance with the lawyers and maybe some discovery of financial documents. And that can be done within a matter of a few weeks. And then you're just waiting for a judge to sign off on the actual uncontested divorce papers. It varies from county to county and state to state. Some counties are notorious for moving things along quickly. Others are notorious for moving at a complete snail's pace.
Question. And I heard, because I also heard a number which I thought was long. Like once everyone agrees and you submit, I guess the lawyer submit the documents to a court, that takes 3 or 4 months by itself, doesn't it?
Like here in New York County, it used to take 3 or 4 months. Now it could take 9 months to a year.
Wow.
I literally a month ago, I was putting in a request to expedite the papers because my client was getting remarried and his fiance was due to have a baby. And so the reality is that these clerks, they work from 9 to 4:30 and they're entitled to a lunch break. And come 4:30, they're leaving. They're required to leave, and they're catching up from that backlog from the pandemic. It's not as bad as it was last year, but I've tried cases where you put in your evidence, then you put in a brief, which takes about 6 months, and then you wait for that judge to render a decision, which could take 2 years. It's
Wow.
literally stuck in purgatory.
Yeah.
So you talked about why there's been an uptick in mediation. you know, parties and lawyers know that, listen, if you're going to go that route, maybe it makes sense to hire a former judge, hire an attorney that can mediate, and maybe you're even taking at least the financial issues. You can't push off custody issues to a third person other than a judge, but you can have, let's say, someone who would be a mediator, whether it's an attorney or a retired judge or a referee. It's like a paid judge, a paid, we call it like arbitration, where you can set your schedule. You can, granted, you're paying for it, but there's a value of not having to wait and be a prisoner of the court system.
Yeah, it goes back to this, right. Even with the building department, talking about real estate and getting things approved, we keep talking about this common theme of just the bureaucracy of getting things approved and getting things done with the city. And it sounds like it's not just the construction world and the architecture world, but it sounds like, you know, also here, you know, as something as divorce, you know, if all the parties agreed and you walk into an office, why not just stamp it and send it out, right? And you're telling me now this could take, you know, 4 months, 5 months to a year. It's
you know, listen, it's not, I get it. You can't fault the judges and the clerks because they only have so much time. But at the end of the day, when you're a practitioner and you're trying to maintain, you know, relationships with a client, us as matrimonial practitioners, we get lumped in there, and it's like, how come you can't move this along?
Yeah.
And it's hard. I have these conversations over and over again to explain just the sad realities of the delay.
Architects get the same abuse. You know, it's always the architect's fault on why we can't get permits. It's just unbelievable.
Oh, did you practice in Jersey too?
I don't practice in Jersey. I used to be admitted. I found that it was much more sensible for my clients to refer them off to colleagues that I have relationships with, who are have relationships with the judges there. From time to time, I do take on a case in New Jersey, but I'll have local counsel. I have litigated in many other jurisdictions, and they go in what we call pro hoc vice, but more often than not, I'm just referring the matter to somebody. While it's just over the bridge, there's different rules, there are different players, and it's better suited to have somebody who's there in the trenches on a day-in, day-in basis.
Yep, that makes sense. So jumping right in, right? So especially as it pertains to real estate, what are, I guess, some of the common mistakes or really suggestions that you have for people as far as protecting your assets, not only from divorce, but in general? After doing this for so many years.
Yeah, and I think, and Arthur, not to interrupt you, but you know, I think there's two sides to the story, right? It's you maybe being single, owning real estate, and planning on getting married. You know, what are some moves or pitfalls mistakes people make, and then, you know, once you're married in a relationship and you create these marital assets, you know, the mistakes people make and how those pitfalls fall.
So we could probably talk for hours on this subject alone. There are a lot of mistakes and pitfalls, and listen, I represent both sides, you know, and when I say I represent both sides, what I mean is I may, in one case, represent the titled spouse. In other case, I may represent the non-titled spouse. So my answer is going to be different depending on the scenario. Then there's what we see most common, certainly, at least for the marital residence. Marital residence essentially is the home where the family lives. We'll see that property's typically jointly held by the parties. Okay, what's a pitfall? Well, a pitfall, if you're the titled spouse, let's say, and when I say titled spouse, you're the moneyed spouse, and you came to the marriage with significant wealth, and during the marriage, you literally bought the house free and clear and you put it in joint names. If you move that asset, if you moved separate property over and just made a different shape, it was a bank account. I had $4 million in a bank account. Now I bought a condo on the Upper West Side, you have a tracing to say, and listen, there's no mortgage, so it's not like I was putting in marital money, then you're going to make a great argument why that should be, virtually all of that should be separate property. Whereas you take that $4 million and you put it in joint names. Now there's a presumption that it was acquired during the marriage, so it's marital. And now yes, you'll get a separate property credit, but all that appreciation is going to be at least up for grabs as to how that's being divided in the event of a divorce. So title certainly matters. Although in most states, title does not matter. If you acquired an asset during the marriage, whether it's in one party's name or if it's jointly held, it's going to be subject to division. But the issue is, how is that asset acquired? Did somebody bring in separate property? Is there a mortgage? Because make no mistake, the bank owns a portion of the property if you're getting a mortgage. And if you're funding it with marital assets, then you're going to get your separate property contribution, but the rest is going to be deemed marital. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yep.
Other pitfalls or strategies? Tell me how you want me to answer that. I can go in a lot of different directions.
I have one thing in particular. So, especially because it pertains to certainly me and Dom and a lot of people that we deal with. So I own a property with multiple partners, one partner, three partners, whatever it may be. It's owned in an LLC. I'm getting divorced, or one of my partners is getting divorced, right? And they're forcing a division of assets. How does that work? What happens, and how do you?
So the first thing I would say in that scenario is let's start at the point before you get married. If you have many partners, whether it's an LLC that holds real estate or some other entity, your partners, the last thing they want is an angry spouse coming in and looking at books and records and looking at their business. And so when I see multiple owners, the first thing that should be considered is a prenup. So there's going to be no discovery in the event of a divorce. That's off limits. It's a fractional share anyway. And I'm a 25% owner. My contribution was prior to the marriage. So why should you share in that anyway? That's issue one. I strongly recommend consulting on a prenup. Okay, so now you don't have a prenup and now you have an LLC. What are you going to do? The question is, does that LLC, now you're going to have a lawyer like myself on the other side come in and try to, bring in a forensic accountant and bring in a real estate expert. Does that entity do anything more than just hold a real estate investment? If it's just a piece of real estate, it's just going to be the value of that property and whacking out your, let's say, 25% share again. But if we're talking about this is an income producing property, it's more than just looking at the value of the asset. Now we're looking at rent rolls and figuring out income. So again, the prenup comes into play to avoid having a lot of different experts in the wallet. I do recommend trusts to hold the real estate. The question though there is the trust set up for estate purposes and succession planning, or is this set up to defraud your spouse in a divorce or creditors down the road? And if it's a revocable trust and you still have control of that trust vehicle, the court is more inclined, and let's say you set that up 6 months before the divorce filing and you filed for divorce, then the court's going to be like, nice try. And they'll blow up that trust. But if you set up that irrevocable trust for the benefit of your kids, it's irrevocable, you have no control, it's going to your kids, and that was done 10 years ago, that your spouse is going to have a really hard time blowing that up, and it's not going to be part of the marital estate for purposes of dividing up that asset.
Now, if you're getting divorced now, and I'm not really familiar with this, but you're getting divorced and now there's division of assets, right? Now, but let's just say you are in multiple assets that are long-term plays. Can the court basically force sales?
So that's a good question. So during a divorce, the court cannot force the sale of a marital residence. As you know, if you own a jointly titled property that was acquired during the marriage, we call that joint tenants in the entirety. Okay, so the court can't dispose and distinguish that relationship until they dissolve the marriage. There's some rare exceptions. Only by agreement can the parties, let's say, list the property for sale during the pendency of the divorce. If that's like the largest asset that the parties have, and let's say somebody lost their job and they're bleeding out and they need those funds and they have to liquidate essentially and sell that property, because the only way the court's going to order it is if it's in imminent foreclosure. Now, we all know imminent foreclosure could take a really long time, but if not selling that is going to frustrate the estate, the court will direct its sale. Those are rare exceptions. So you can use that, one party can use that as leverage if, let's say, the other person wants to sell the property. They can prolong the divorce, and you see this in a lot of respects. You often see this, you were talking about what things people can do. What happens once you have a settlement agreement, putting in those key terms? Let's say the parties agree we're going to sell that home, but there's no provisions on how you're going to sell it. Who's the broker going to be? What's the listing price going to be? Are there going to be step downs? What are we going to do if we can't remove the person's name on a buyout off the mortgage? These are all things. There's a list of things that a good matrimonial practitioner should be advising their clients to put in, depending on who they're representing. If you have a spouse who says, I don't want to ever leave this place, and he's paying for all the bills, and that's what the agreement says, he's going to continue to pay the carrying charges on the marital residence, maybe the lawyer representing that individual says, we're not going to put any of those terms in. But if you represent the person who's on the hook for not only paying for all the carrying charges and for the marital residence, but also paying for their home, they're going to make sure there are step downs, because we don't want to let 2 years go by and there's the house is still sitting there.
And how does it work with an investment property, right? So back to like you're 25% owner in a property, it doesn't make sense to sell it for 5 or 10 years. I mean, clearly you can do a buyout and then the asset stays in your name. But if you don't have the money to do the buyout, at that point, could there be a force of sale?
And just to tie the loop on the question, on that marital residence, if the parties have not made a decision, the court's the easiest thing is to direct the sale. It becomes a little bit tricky when children are involved. But if parties can't agree, there's only so many options. It's either one person's going to buy the other person out, or they're going to or they're going to agree to sell it. If they don't agree to sell it, and when we talk about agreeing to sell, it could be shortly after the divorce. It could be years later. For example, you have 2 little kids. You don't want to disturb the only stable thing going on in their life, which is their home the only home that they've ever lived in. We're going to say what we see all the time, or very often, that we're not going to sell until the youngest goes off to college. Okay, provided the people have the financial wherewithal to maintain that status quo. Whether it's an investment property, whether it's a home in the Hamptons or a country home, that's getting sold unless you guys can agree that some other type of division. An investment property, if it's a business, most likely the title spouse is going to keep it, and there's going to be a negotiated number to pay them off. Otherwise, the asset's going to be sold, just like a brokerage account's going to be divided.
We were talking briefly offline about how we're in a totally different interest rate environment, right? So values have fluctuated. The ability to buy people out, I'm sure, has fluctuated. What are some of the some of the changes you've seen, post COVID?
I think what we're seeing with the real estate community right now, depending on the community that you're in, will dictate how you're going to make a decision on disposing of that real property. For example, there is no, at least what I'm seeing, there is no inventory on the market. So if you are contemplating selling, we used to say, okay, you want to wait till the spring. The spring is the best time. You don't want to wait until the summer. People are out, kids are away. You're in the Hamptons. We're not focusing on selling that apartment in the city. With such little inventory, you're going to expect a bidding war, and that property may be on the market for a matter of days. And so you better have a contingency plan. You better know where you're going to live and how those bills are going to be paid. Instead of living in one home, now we got to pay for two homes. How are those expenses going to be paid? In some of the outer boroughs, it may be a little bit of a different story, or depending on the economic bracket, where a house may sit longer than what the sellers desire, because somebody is planning to buy a piece of property, and now that the interest rate has gone up, they're going to look at more expenses that they didn't contemplate. So I think it all depends. But what I'm seeing at the level of people that I represent is that you make a decision, that property is going to move quick. We're seeing a lot of people getting well over ask. People are paying a premium for the property they're looking at in some of these wealthier suburbs and in the areas in Manhattan.
Again, back to that investment property, because I know Rob and I know a lot of people involved that deals with as many partners. You're 25%, you don't have the cash to buy her out. The asset has to be sold. You have multiple partners. Of course, maybe a partner could buy out your shares, and now you have the cash to then buy out the spouse. But let's just say in the event you can't, a judge can really force the sale in order to get the spouse the proceeds?
So no. So the court's not, in that scenario, the court's not going to force the sale of that property. And I think it's also important to look at what's the entire marital estate. If, let's say, that 25% interest that Rob owns is worth $500,000, but there's retirement assets, you're going to horse trade. If there's a brokerage account, there are other assets where you can offset. Maybe that spouse is going to agree to an as if and when scenario. Or maybe you're not going to pay the entire $500,000 that the spouse is entitled to get now. You're going to pay it out over, let's say, a 3-year window, a 5-year window, whatever it is. As you stretch out payments, you may run into the issue of now having to add in interest, because that you're basically, that's the person's entitled to their money on divorce. They may be looking at getting some interest. They're entitled to that. The court's not going to direct the sale of that, assuming that there are other assets to glom.
Now, and if you have tight operating agreements with these assets, I mean, that does carry some weight, right? It has to revert to that.
100%.
What other real estate tips can you give for people that own, maybe looking to get married or married looking to get divorced, right? Obviously, a prenup is always, if hindsight's 20/20, get the prenup before you get married. I think owning property is, in the eyes of divorce, is owning property in LLC compared to personal names beneficial, obviously for tax purposes and maybe running a business, and for liability purposes, you want to have those investments in LLCs, not your personal name. But what are some real easy tips we can give people that, again, have real estate, want to get married, have real estate, want to get divorced? I'm sure there's a bunch of stupid things that men do every day.
100%. Let's keep this very high level and very simple. Main thing, record keeping. I know it sounds tedious. I know it sounds annoying, but good record keeping rises to the top. And if you're contemplating divorce, or even if you're not, just plan, have a file, and make sure if you are planning for divorce, make sure that file no longer stays in the home, because that real estate file in your file cabinet in the home office magically disappears when you become an index number. And now you have all of your proofs of your separate property contributions, or let's say you borrowed money from your brother for the down payment, and you have your loans in there. That's another thing which I'll touch upon in a second. That magically disappears when somebody's angry and says, well, I don't know what documents you're referring to. And in every case, there's two types of evidence. There's documentary evidence, and then there's oral evidence. Oral evidence is testimony. And the best type of evidence, because I live in the world of he said, she said, she said, she said, he said, whatever it is, it's one person's word against the other. And the best thing available is the document. Document speaks for itself. So if you have the proof, if you keep a good record, put it on a computer, make sure it's password protected so nobody else can get to it. And so when you meet with the lawyer, and the first thing they're going to say is, do you have the backup to that? It's easily accessible. We talk about the gifts. More often than not, newly married family, they couple a gift. You got married. Well, I want to buy a house. We're going to have kids. You get a gift from parents. We want to give you a down payment. Is it a gift or is it a loan? Make sure if it's in fact a loan, you want to have the necessary paperwork to show that you got the loan from that person. Because then you're going to be having a fight with your spouse who's going to say, no, that was a gift to the two of us. Conversely, if it is a gift, make sure, here's an email. I love you guys. Good luck on the home. This is to both of you. So that the person now saying it's a loan says, here's the Hallmark card.
What's that cliche thing people say about the ring? If the ring is a gift, let's just say for a holiday, it means something different than as opposed to just
yeah. They say don't give a ring
right.
on Christmas.
So I say Valentine's Day, because what we call that's an engagement ring is what we call a gift in contemplation of marriage. So, and I've dealt with this many times. Someone gives an engagement ring on Valentine's Day. Someone gives an engagement ring on a birthday. And that is a huge no-no, because now that person's arguing, no, you gave that to me for my birthday, not to get married.
So I think what this really comes down to, Dom, and that's the trend that we've seen with pretty much every episode, is just, while some people view it as an expense, it's just absolutely crucial to have a top team handling all aspects of these things. And when you're making major life decisions, it's important to speak to an attorney or an accountant or whatever the real estate professional, whatever it may be for whatever the topic is. It's just crucial to make sure that you're preparing properly, just to make sure that people don't get hurt ultimately in the long run. So, with that, my next question is, so, what brought you into law? I know you got some pretty high-end clients. I don't know if you could mention any of them, but what brought you into this, and specifically this
I wish I could say that it was a really fun, sexy reason that I'm a matrimonial lawyer. I don't know many people that wake up and say, I need to be a divorce lawyer when they're 5 years old. And that's certainly not my story. The short version is I didn't want to be a lawyer. My dad was a matrimonial lawyer. I wanted to go to LA, and I got the offer I couldn't refuse. I joke, the Jewish offer I couldn't refuse. You go to LA, you're on your own. You go to law school, and I'll take care of it. And my dad represented a lot of entertainers, and they would say to me, you got to be crazy to pass up an opportunity to go to law school and not be saddled with loans. And I knew that one day I wanted to have a family and provide and so I really loved the thought of having stability. And I thought I was going to go be an actor after I graduated and sat for the bar. My dad ended up falling ill, and I went to go work for a banking firm. And I really thought that I hated practicing family law. And I quickly realized that I missed helping individuals. So I came back, I worked for a boutique firm, and I since worked for the biggest matrimonial lawyers in the country. And then I couldn't wait to come back and help an individual. We were saving, I remember we represented all the big banks. And I remember being on the phone with somebody at Chase, and we had resolved a major deal. And then it's like, all right, I'll talk to you tomorrow. There wasn't that individual gratification that you get from helping an individual.
What are some standout moments in your career? I'm sure you have some interesting or sad or exciting or memorable moments. What stands out? I mean, you've been in business a long time. When you talk to your kids and you had an interesting day, what are some stories that come out?
So I can answer that in so many different directions. I have seen and literally heard it all. I can talk about a major highlight where I did, I think, the first parentage order in the state of New York, certainly in Suffolk County.
What was it?
You used to have to, for same-sex individuals, they used to have to go through a whole adoption process and have a social worker come to their home and interview them, because one parent was the biological parent and the other was essentially the adoptive parent. And we recently, New York enacted a law where you didn't have to go through all the red tape. It was just some paperwork where the parent's name would go on the birth certificate. They were together, same sex, and I represented a lesbian couple, and they were adopting a beautiful baby. And one mom was carrying the baby, and it was the first of its kind in New York. And I'm used to dealing with people in their worst times. Even the easy divorces are gut-wrenching, okay? And this was a happy moment. Everybody in the courtroom was smiling, and that's a really touching, defining moment in my career that happened fairly recently.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. An awesome experience. And then I represented them again when they had their second boy. And it's just, I don't often, you have a real estate closing and everyone walks out. The seller gets their money, the buyer gets their new home. Typically, like, we say there are no winners. I know people are, did you kill them? To a certain degree, everybody loses in a divorce. So that was a nice change. I've had some nice wins. I've seen some craziness. I've had cases where, clients did not want to get divorced because in their culture, it was literally frowned upon. And I represented a woman from Hong Kong whose husband was a very successful Wall Street guy and was very physically abusive. Literally, I would see photos of her all bruised up. And he had many, many significant others, and she refused to get divorced. And she went back home. We were trying to help her negotiate a deal. She committed suicide because she could not stomach the social stigma in her culture for having gone through a divorce, and the level of abuse and anxiety that must have been carrying on her shoulders. It's just not a great moment. I've negotiated a prenup where these are just crazy story after crazy story. A woman was going to get, essentially, there was a penalty for every time her fiance was to get caught cheating, and she was getting $2 million in the prenup. So we literally would have private investigators camped out outside hotel rooms to catch this guy in the act.
Wow. So you got a really happy, you got a terrible, tragedy.
But if you think about that scenario, like that's tragic in and of itself. We have literally a spouse who, by virtue of the document, is literally hoping to catch their spouse fuck up.
$2 million,
Right.
$2 million on each occurrence.
On each occurrence, and we had
Wow.
3 occurrences that we knew of.
Well, it's like that famous movie with George Clooney where he plays the divorce attorney.
The Massey prenup.
Wow,
Yeah, it was so great.
Wow.
So is there any other like crazy ones where like you found, I don't know, where people had multiple families or just crazy assets, high crazy assets?
Interesting. I've seen scenarios with like devout religious individuals who have multiple families and they're living these separate lives. And I don't know. I'm exhausted when I go home to my family. How do they manage not one family, not 2 families, multiple families? How are they juggling that? It's mind-boggling to do that, and just the anxiety. I've represented spouses who were married to big Wall Street individuals who very, white shoe firms, who those guys are going to S&M clubs, giving their spouse an STD, which that's a tort. Giving your spouse a sexually transmitted disease, that is an actionable tort. She ended up getting an extra $10 million in her divorce settlement because he also wanted to keep her quiet because, God forbid, somebody at his bank ever found out that he frequented S&M clubs. And, so it's,
wow.
I have seen human nature is certainly very, very interesting.
You mentioned it offline. You've seen the underbelly of humanity.
It is. There's a judge
Makes sense.
that she's now retired, and I have a lot of respect for her. And she used to sit in the criminal part before she sat in the matrimonial part for many, many years. And she would say the difference between the criminal part and the matrimonial part. In the criminal part, you're dealing with relatively horrible people on their best behavior. And in the matrimonial part, you're dealing with relatively great people on their worst behavior. And that is such a perfect explanation.
Wow.
That's actually a really good way to close. This was crazy insightful. I really, really enjoyed this. So it was great to meet you. Thank you so much for being on, Arthur. Really,
thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I would love, I've got a podcast, Close to the Vest. I'd love for you guys to come share some of your stories. I'm sure there's a lot we could chop up.
Yeah, and I want to learn more about you personally. When we do that, I want to hear. I hear you're into sneakers and you have some other things going on.
Perfect. I'd love that.
All right. Thanks so much, Arthur. We'll talk soon.